in the future.
There are no people.
There are no people in the future.
No people at all.
There are no people in the future.
Where did all my people go?
There are no people in the future.
Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away now.
Hey, everybody, welcome. Yes, it is a pre-Thanksgiving Out to Coop Live. Here we are. It is Monday, November 22nd, 2021. Welcome to Raging Chicken's Out to Coop Live. This is, of course, Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. On Out to Coop Live, we talk to progressives, activists, and troublemakers of all sorts, right from our own backyards and across the country. On Fridays, Sean Kitchen and I break down the good, the bad, and the ugly in state and national politics. And you got to check out the Wednesday show with Cyril Michaleko. Cyril, of course, is a progressive columnist for the Bucks County Courier-Times and the Intelligencer. And he joins me to drill down into Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and international politics. You can get all our shows by subscribing to our podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify. Look, wherever you get your podcasts, you can get it there. And you can help support this show by heading on over to Patreon. You can help support for as little as $5 a month. $5 is like a good beer once a month, right? $5 a month at patreon.com/rcpress. You can also help out this show by heading over to our YouTube channel if you're not there already. Smash that subscribe button, like the stream for the show, and hit that notification bell so you know every time that we go live. And you want to see how you can join our Discord server? Info in the show notes, everybody. You can check in on that. We can continue the conversation all night long. And week long. And year long, really. And for more PA Progressive talk, tune into the Rick Smith Show's live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern on his YouTube channel, Twitter, wherever you get your streaming content. Rick is there. And check out all his shows over at thericksmithshow.com. Like I've been saying, Rick's show has been taken off. He has now got his show on WBAI in New York, KPFK in Los Angeles, right? He's got his show on Free Speech TV on Saturdays. I mean, look, this is the time. Like, as Rick always says, you stay in the room long enough, people are going to notice. Well, head on over to thericksmithshow.com for all the latest across all his platforms. And if you haven't checked it out already, you got to check out the Sisters of the Night Caucus podcast. The amazing PA women stirring the political cauldron behind this podcast rock the house, and they know where the bodies are buried. Woo. Make sure to follow them also on Twitter at the Night Caucus. That is at the Night Caucus on Twitter. And subscribe to their podcast, Anchor, Spotify, iTunes. You get it. You know how it goes. And attention gamers, the Game In, that's with two N's, the Game In is a Quakertown-based black family-owned gaming store. They're friends of the show, and they've got everything from retro N64s to the latest consoles, video games for all platforms, collectibles, action figures, Funko Pops, you got it, right? And kids get discounts with every A on their report card. And then guess what? The grades just came out last week, so what a better time as you're headed into this wonderful holiday season. And check out them on their Facebook page and follow them on Twitter at The Game In, again with two N's. That's at The Game In on Twitter. Got a question about a game, looking for something hard to get? Shoot me an email at thegameinpa@gmail.com. Oh, God. And a special shout out, as always, goes to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff on his YouTube page and follow him on Twitter at SongADayMan. Again, two N's. That's at SongADayMan on Twitter. So we're getting a little kind of pause in some of the weekly programming here this week with Thanksgiving break coming up and everything like this. I might be hopping on for a little special later on in the week, but for the most part, Cyril and I are off for the Wednesday show this week, and Sean is gone back to family for the holidays. So we're just going to skip Friday's show there too as well, but we will be back next Monday. And I'll let you know what we're going to got going on Monday. We've got a kind of one of two options is going to happen for the Monday, for next Monday's show. So check out our streams and check out all of our socials for info on that. So on tonight's show, I'm absolutely thrilled tonight to be welcoming Gwendolyn Marshall to the show. We'll be talking about her book, Ancestry Culture, an Alternative to Race in 5e. Yes, that is the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. I told you we're breaking format a little bit here tonight, which I'm totally psyched about. So, I mean, that Dungeons & Dragons, yes, that one, right? Now, as the Black Lives Matter movement has brought renewed attention to the centrality of race in American history and contemporary capitalism, fans of tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons have been looking for ways to ensure the games they love don't reproduce exploitative and oppressive discourses on race. During the COVID-19 pandemic, D&D has seen an explosion of new players and a renewed energy to take the rules of the game into the 21st century. Ancestry Culture, an alternative to race in 5e, is a standout example of this work and has won awards to prove it. Now, Gwendolyn Marshall is an associate professor of philosophy at Florida International University, where she works on early modern philosophy and feminist history of philosophy. As co-owner of Arcanist Press, Arcanist Press or Arcanist Press? Arcanist Press.
I usually say Arcanist.
Arcanist. See, there you go. I should have just asked before the show. Arcanist, there we go, of Arcanist Press. She is also a game designer and publisher, having published the award-winning Ancestry Culture, as we just mentioned, and the upcoming S5E, Superheroic Roleplaying for the 5th edition, which I am totally psyched about. She is also a parent, punk, leftist, and all-around geek, as well as a trans woman. So, listen, we're going to have a great conversation tonight. If you want to stick around for the community after show, everybody can do that. We'll do that today after the break. Information on how to join that on Riverside.fm is in today's show notes. But Gwendolyn, welcome to the show.
Wow, thanks for having me.
Well, I have to admit, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I am just so freaking psyched about this book and the kind of work that you're doing. And, you know, especially coming at a time when, you know, I'm like I mentioned to you before the show, you know, I'm looking to kind of create a campaign for my kids for the first time ever. So, you know, thank you for this book. What I'm saying.
You're welcome.
So let me just set a little context for everybody who's normally tuning into the show, and a little bit about why I thought this is kind of appropriate and important now. So I basically had three things. One I've already mentioned. This is the first time that I've ever been kind of creating a campaign from the ground up for kind of my kids. I've never done that before. I've never DM'd Dungeons and Dragons stuff before. So this is the first time I'm thinking actively about the story that's involved. And I found out in that process, there were some things just feeling a little bit uncomfortable, right? Especially around the essentialism around the race. Like if you're a dwarf, you're this. If you're an elf, you're this. If you're, you know, an orc, you're this. And that became increasingly problematic. So the second thing is as I mentioned there, is we see this explosion of interest in D&D for a whole new generation of gamers. I mean, I was just checking it out before the show tonight. It's like, you know, D&D is 47 years old. The first edition came out in 1974. So this is, you know, like, this is, you know, a whole new generation of people that are excited about it. And the experiences they're bringing to the game are just freaking amazing, right? You have more people, like, you know, as I've been seeing through different YouTube shows and different channels and different, you know, Twitch channels where, you know, you have people of color getting involved. You kind of have the questions of gender and sexuality foregrounded in some of these games. It's absolutely fascinating. And then the third part of it is the real kind of political edge of it for me is that you see what happened, what the alt-right did with the video game culture, and use that as a platform to kind of sneak in the back door and kind of create a toxic environment and really recruit kind of and kind of like really infect that entire space with this kind of extremist white nationalist kind of misogynistic kind of mentality. And so to see people like you and a whole bunch of other folks doing this work to kind of not letting that come to D&D is fascinating. So there's my setup, right? You know, so let me ask you this. So, I mean, what brought you to kind of decide to kind of create this, right? Walk us through a little bit about kind of what you were kind of getting at and why you thought this was important to put out there.
Sure. I myself have been playing D&D since 1982 or 83. The basic D&D red box, and first edition, and then second edition, and then third edition, and then grad school happened and kids happened. So I took a break, but I came back in 2014, and you know, when I came back to the tabletop gaming, not just D&D, but the whole hobby, with dozens, hundreds of great games, I came to it with the same mentality I had, which is just I didn't even think about social and political ramifications, but quickly it became clear, oh, that's odd. Just things struck me because I was always, even in the interim, a consumer of fantasy and science fiction and film and TV. And I had seen some of these shifts occurring in those media, but to return to D&D, it was a bit noticeable, let's say, that it was in a lot of ways, especially the 5th edition, was kind of a nostalgic return to my youth, for better and worse. not that long after I started running, I started DMing myself. In fact, I got the band back together, so to speak, and got the people I played with in high school. I got them all back together thanks to online tools. And we played because we're scattered, across the country. So we're playing, and so I started thinking harder about that stuff, and and spending time reading about it online, came across a couple people who were talking about race. The key for me was a blog post by N.K. Jemisin, the fantasy author.
Yeah.
And she had written this in like 2011 or 2012, but I came across it a couple years after that. It was called The Unbearable Baggage of Orking. And she noted that in D&D and in most fantasy fiction, orcs or goblins or kobolds or whatever are basically human-like. They're sentient. They have culture. They have children. They have religion, they have language, but they are subhuman, and really the only thing you can do with them is kill them or drive them off, right? Violence is the only, and so, or you can enslave them in some contexts. And so N.K. Jemisin said, this sounds uncomfortably familiar to some things I'd read in U.S. history and in world history about the suppression and racist white supremacist treatment of, blacks, Africans, etc. And so that kind of got me thinking. And then around this time, 2017, 18, people started this discourse, probably renewed yet again, about the role of orcs and race. And people were taking stabs at solutions, right? And none of them, I agreed with the principles of all of them, but the problem was that there was not going to be a way for me to get my players to just buy into these, because they all usually involve, basically, most people's solution is, well, then don't play D&D. Well, look, this is a nostalgia trip for me and my friends. This is what we played in the 80s and 90s. We want to play D&D, all right? We play other games too, especially I do and my spouse, but we want D&D, but we want it to be, and a lot of us are busy. We don't have time to learn whole complicated rule systems. We want something easy. And so I saw other people's solutions, and there were people like, there's a book out there called Grazilak's Guide to Ancestry, and there's Half Race Handbook, and Tristan Tarwater had a piece on D&D Beyond about this. So people were taking a kind of forays into solving this, and none of them really did it for me. And so I thought, oh, well, I think I might be able to help here, because I'm a college professor by day, philosophy in particular. So I spend my time talking about kind of complicated and sometimes fraught topics, but in a way that is approachable for your 18-year-old who'd never thought about it before. So I thought, well, maybe I can kind of break this down in a way that would be more approachable, because I was thinking of targeting not just the person who already is very aware there's a problem here, but somebody who isn't, namely like some of my players and friends, right? As well. So I just wrote something up and was going to put it online for free, but somebody's like, oh, you should put it on DM's Guild or Drive Through RPG, one of these marketplaces. And I decided, well, I'll do a Kickstarter, because there's a feature in February called Zine Quest, where you can kind of do really low budget, old school zines. And as somebody who grew up kind of a bit of a punk in the 80s and 90s, I was familiar with like zine culture, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. I'll do like a zine. And so I set a goal of $300 so I could buy a piece of cover art to make it look nice. And it kind of blew up. It got like $7,800 in 2 weeks or something. So a little bit more than I expected. So I decided, I took that money and rolled it into like nicer art and more content and all that. And it ended up being pretty wildly successful. And I really think its success is a result of both the fact that I very clearly laid out why it mattered in the intro essay, which is only 2 or 3 pages long. And then the solution is just really simple and straightforward, but works. I think that's, and I was led there again, just to be clear. I want to emphasize this point by learning from mostly creators and players and people of color, who were talking about this. Cause when I was playing in the 80s and 90s, when I first returned as a white person, I was ignorant of my privilege in the way that one is sometimes, unfortunately, and so they educated me, thankfully, and I was able to help in the way I could.
Well, and I think that one, like you said there, like that the intro essay there lays out the question of why, right? So let me just, I'm going to like skip right here, just give people a flavor of it. So you've got this part where you're saying, so why should we do this? Why should we kind of revisit this? You say, first of all, scientists, philosophers who study race reject the concept of race as a biological fact that discretely individuates groups of people. Race is not a biological reality, or rather it is a social concept constructed and employed differently in different times in history, different places in the world. In other words, the concept of race, as it has been used from at least the Enlightenment forward to the 20th century, is frankly bankrupt. And because these are harmful concepts that have no place in our world, they need not be in the stories that we tell our friends together. There's lots of ellipses in there. Let me be clear.
Right.
But and I think that, in a 2 or 3 pages, it's like that right there, I thought was so incredibly accessible. Right, that you see the argument that is there about why it is there, and also what you do a little bit later there is you mentioned like N.K. Jameson, right? You point to these other folks that are doing this work. Because I'll tell you, the first thing that I did is I went out and I tracked them down, right, to read those essays to kind of better understand some of the context for there, and it was so incredibly helpful. And I also think that the system as you lay it out, you're clear, like this is not the end game here, but this is an offer for people to do stuff with, and I think that openness to it is also makes a lot of sense about why it was taken up and had so much success in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, well, first, people like, again, mentioned in the James Mendez Hode's, Graham Barber, their essays on decolonizing D&D and on racism in the fantasy genre were really pivotal for me too. And please, everybody go read their stuff and support them. Yeah, I mean, it really just, it was one of those things that once I saw it, it kind of clicked, and then I couldn't unsee it. Once I started thinking about racial essentialism in the game and how it could, impact a player, it became obvious that this is something we need to do something about. I mean, think about it. If I'm sure that you and I hope your audience doesn't need a justification of content warnings, for example, but I mean, clearly, look, if I'm going to go to a movie with some people, it's perfectly decent and reasonable to talk to them about, well, what kind of content are they in the mood for? Do they not? Maybe some people don't want to watch. Like, I'm not a fan of like misery porn, like Saw or one of those sorts of movies. I can't watch that stuff. So I would say no, thank you. Giving players the option to opt out of, or a GM, DMs to opt out of racial essentialism is just common decency, because sometimes some people report that they have to deal with racism or racial essentialism or kind of these racial dichotomies and supremacies in their daily life. They don't want to encounter it in their escapist leisure or play. And unfortunately, the way that some of the D&D prose is written suggests that, right? That by birth, orcs are, a half-orc is savage and menacing. There's just no getting around it. And there's a long history of kind of much worse statements about race in the fantasy world genre. So it is a thing that bothers some people, and it keeps them out of this domain. And it allows, even if it's just by implicit acceptance, not explicit endorsement of white supremacy or racists, but just by allowing this space to be one where, you can talk about how it's okay for humans to kill whole peoples because they're inferior. I mean, some people aren't really comfortable with them or their kids playing a game where that's the point is murder all the green people because of the color of their skin, right? You're like, oh, that's not the color of your skin shouldn't be a reason you get to kill someone, right? It's not hard to see why somebody who's already aware and sensitized would not be comfortable playing a game with that content. But it can be a fun game if you can learn how to manage or avoid or address that content. So thanks to those great other writers and authors, I was able to do that. And I think that giving those types of players and GMs the opportunity to avoid or remake that content is something that all mass media should, try to do.
100%. And I think that, and one of the ways that, we talked a little about this before the show too, as well, is that one of the ways that I think that you do this really well in Ancestry and Culture is that you make it like accessible to use. And as I was saying, the part of the reason why, at least this is what people have been saying about 5e, and I tend to agree with this, the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, it was released in such a way that to make it a little bit more accessible and streamlined for folks. A lot of what kept people away from D&D and other role-playing games too as well is just like you're doing math all the time, right? And you have to know these really complicated rules. And 5e kind of opened that up a little bit and brought in kind of more folks to it. And so you do something here kind of a similar thing, but instead of trying to rewrite everything from the ground up, right, you basically say, look, we could do something simple, right? We can take race and we could say, we can move away from race. We could talk about ancestry and culture. Could you talk a little bit about those categories and how you see them kind of undoing some of the stuff you do or that you're critiquing on race?
Sure. So for those who don't know, the way race is treated in like vanilla, unchanged D&D from the beginning, although there are some variations in some of the editions and in some of the settings. There's a setting called Eberron where some of these rules are not fully followed, which is a good thing. But generally speaking, when you choose race, you get a set of characteristics that give you stats. They basically help you. Like, elves are basically generally smarter, generally more dexterous. Dwarves are tougher. Humans are more versatile. Halflings are usually dexterous and sneaky, and that sort of thing. Halfling is the non-getting sued version of a hobbit, for those who don't know, from Lord of the Rings.
Right.
And anyway, so you basically are when you choose race, you choose not just something about whatever, a category that's applied to you, but a whole set of characteristics that are universally applied to members of that race. Now, of course, there's always the qualification you can find in every D&D book that's like, really, the story is up to you, so change what you like. But the default as written rules are that everyone who has an orc parent is from birth a savage and menacing individual. So that's kind of a bummer. But especially it's weird when you look, and choosing your race also determines what language you speak. It determines your skills, things like if you're good with certain professions, like their tools, proficiencies. In other words, it tells you not just things that might be related to your birth, but things that are related to what you're doing as an adult. And it seems obvious to me that those don't match up. So I simply took the set of traits you get when you choose race, and I split them into two. The ones that are reasonably ascribed to parentage, like you can be a bird person. So if that's one of the, there's different kinds of bird people you can be in this game. And so if you have bird people parents, you're going to have wings. If you have fish people parents, you're going to have gills. If you have parents with what are called dark vision, eyes that are kind of good at seeing in the dark at night, then you too will have those features because those are obviously inherited. But what languages you speak, whether you're good with a certain weapon or tool, whether you use certain styles of combat, those are things that are taught, obviously. And they can differ from place to place and person to person, regardless of who your parents are. So I said, well, what kinds of traits are going to go into something like culture? And so instead of just choosing race, elf, dwarf, human, you choose twice. Race, or you choose ancestry, I'll be an elf, but my culture will be something different. Maybe you can choose elf again, and then you're just, if you know your fantasy, you're Legolas, the elfiest elf that ever elfed. But maybe you want to be, if I'm going to throw a couple other fantasies out here, again from Lord of the Rings, you could be Aragorn, which is a human who's largely raised in a kind of more elven way, so his elven cultural traits. Or you could be, to go to Terry Pratchett, Carrot Iron Founderson, who is a human raised by dwarves. And they refer to him, he's like, I'm a dwarf. I have human parents, but I'm culturally dwarven. Right. And I mean, so what's interesting is that, side note, some of our favorite characters are these kind of fish out of water, interesting, unusual characters. And so it actually fits perfectly in the fantasy genre. It's super simple. If you know what choosing an elf means for race, you just choose twice. And then you've managed to take the things we don't want to ascribe to birth and put them where they belong in upbringing and culture. And that removes much of the essentialism, right? Because that's really what racial essentialism is, right?
Yeah, and I think this whole idea about, say, the choices, even if you take, say, like two dwarves, right, kind of growing up in the context, and one dwarf decides to follow their parents, like, and their parents are very kind of culturally purist dwarf, right, but the other one has been decided they like to read, right, and start wondering about all these other different kind of options, right, and kind of what are some of the other ways to kind of explore the world, and maybe having this tension with that kind of dwarvish culture by saying, wait a minute, why, and I grew up in the Catholic Church, right? So having the same kind of that whole idea is like, okay, I could follow this kind of rigid set of things and I'm only this thing. But then if I start looking around and having questions about why are we making these distinctions over here? And then it opens up my mind. And not only is that interesting just in terms of the dynamics or dynamics of the game, but in terms of the storytelling too. About thinking about what these characters, what motivates these characters, what their backstories are, what they're interesting, and it opens up a whole range of kind of storytelling that was really, I think, limited by a more rigid adherence to these questions of race.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, look, the reason that fantasy and science fiction and genre authors and creators which includes game creators, the reason we sometimes use tropes is as a shortcut. It's a kind of a labor saver, right? If I say there's an elf in the corner, those of you who know fantasy, most people, at least you have some idea about what that looks like, right? So it saves time. But the problem is that ends up being kind of impoverished narratively, because when you're making your character, you might say, well, I'm an elf. And then okay. I guess that means you're just like every other elf. How boring, right? But if you're given the opportunity to say, well, my parents were like this, but I actually grew up among dwarves, or I actually left home and traveled the world and settled with in a nice little community of gnomes. And so now I've adopted their ways. And so I'm an elf who's culturally gnomish or whatever, right? And it also says something interesting narratively about the world, is that it's a cosmopolitan place. There are migrations, there's people interacting, different peoples, right? And so like one of the other things that this set of rules adds is, of course, the ability to create characters of mixed ancestry, right? And that's been really fraught in D&D previous to now, because for the most part, you could only make half humans mixed with something else. Right. And the whole way of talking about race, where you say this character who has an elf parent and a human parent is half elf. You don't say half human. You say half elf, as though that a very othering way of talking about that. Also, there's a problem that technically having any elven heritage makes you half, right? So there's like a one drop concept going on there. Exactly. Right. So there's all kinds of like, oh, actually, that's kind of gross race concepts behind a lot of these like simple tropes. And so once I saw that, I thought, I don't like that. And fortunately, I kind of came across a really easy way to remove most of it in just a few pages. So I've also been really pleasantly surprised and happy with also what it does to help improve storytelling,
Yeah, and I think, there it is. That's the kind of golden goose right there, if you will, right? I mean, it's like, have something that's actually going to allow somebody a different point of entry into this, into this world, and actually to enhance, like, what I think why people, those folks who love D&D and why they love D&D, or why they love other kind of role-playing games, is because it allows you to kind of inhabit those characters. And, I haven't, I mentioned this too as well, and people heard me talk about this on the show multiple times, is like, we have this segment on our Friday show. It's called like The Last Call, which we talk about just kind of random, whatever else is going on in the world, that in our lives and stuff. And I've been talking about, watching the dungeon run and kind of developing this campaign and stuff. And they've had some kind of guest side quests on this YouTube show, and they've been, actively bringing in kind of like, these gamers of color, right? So you have these 3 black halflings that have come on.
That's a great show.
Oh yeah, it's
3 black halflings.
Yeah, they're great. And when they talk about on their own podcast, where they're talking about their own histories of gaming and kind of growing up in that, in addition to actually doing the games, is great stuff, and I think that to be able to introduce, introduce my kids and all this stuff, and what you mentioned earlier is really right to the point, is growing up with it, not being so critical about it, how we're approaching it, but then suddenly then turning and saying, okay, am I really comfortable having this 13-year-old and 10-year-old start something and say, you can just go kill all these people?
Okay, so I have to jump in here because I have 2 children and they're 12 and 10.
Oh, they're virtually the same age.
Yeah, 2 boys, 12 and 10.
And a boy and a girl.
And they're really, because we play D&D sometimes and we watch and consume science fiction, fantasy media, and all the comic book movies, because that was me growing up. And so that's a way for me to share with that. I love that with them. But they also play video games. And it's been really interesting, but also a little scary to see them because we've been pretty restrictive with allowing them. We don't give them free reign of the internet. But it's like, we want to check in on, well, what multiplayer? Okay, you want to play Minecraft today? Okay, that Minecraft is generally a safe one, right? But sometimes there's some bad corners and we don't let them play like Call of Duty or any of the very militaristic ones. But then things like Overwatch and Fortnite are like, okay, but let's make sure you're not playing with strangers because a lot of the times they'll be awful people.
Right.
I'm happy to report that the gaming world, the tabletop world, at least in the role-playing game world, has been more welcoming and more pluralistic. It's all, of course, there's still work to do, but I think in comparison to video games, it's much better. There's a lot of the big people at the top, like Wizards of the Coast and just recently Games Workshop, who makes the Warhammer series of games, have made repeated statements in support of like Black Lives Matter and the inclusion of LGBT people. And, I was at a convention recently in person, finally, again, after the pandemic, masked up. Of course, it was vaccinated people only allowed at this convention. And, it was, it's pretty accepting. And I think the community's come a pretty long way since I was a kid, when it was mostly a Midwestern white person's activity.
Yes. Well, let me ask you about this now. This is a nice little segue. You brought up the convention with here, because one of the things that, I found this out kind of like searching out, like, okay, how do I get in touch with this person that wrote this book, right? So you've just recently come out as a trans woman, and this was, you mentioned this convention was the first time that you were going to that there. And so, and I guess this is kind of, you're already have answered part of my question, is like, what's that kind of reception like with that gaming community? And what's that experience like kind of coming back to that crew?
Right. I had a good experience. I went to a convention called Gamehole Con.
I love that name, by the way. I had no idea what it was, and I'm like, that is awesome.
So there's a store. There's a store in Madison, Wisconsin called the Game Hole, and so the owner and people there organized a convention. So it got called Gamehole Con, which is that it's a name, and but it's super friendly. They're great people, and it's a great convention. It's super friendly, and no, it's been I was kind of moving in this space for a few years, thinking of myself as kind of like queer or non-binary, but that's not visible, right? I passed as a cishet white person, right? Man is what I looked like to people. And, I'm 47 and I've got kids and I live in the suburban Midwest, and I'm very majority kind of demographic, so to speak. Right. So I flew under the radar, but coming out, being, a visibly trans woman in that space was scary at first, just because it was new, but people were friendly. The only time I did have one older guy just stare at me like they just couldn't figure it out. Like they're like, what, right? Or I don't know if I made them uncomfortable or they were just like interested or curious, but it was fine actually, because several people, I'll admit, mostly femme presenting people, women, went out of their way to be like, oh, hey, I really like your mask, or you so glad you're here, or whatever. So that was really nice. Everyone was, and there's like a table at all of these conventions that's like called the what is it called? Like Tabletop Gamers, GAYMER, which is so they have, they're handing out like LGBT different tags and flags and ally things that you can wear, and there's people wearing it all over the place. And there's a lot of kind of prominent streamers and creators now that are LGBT and people of color. So, for example, Tanya DePass is a great creator and community leader. She just won Game Her Award, which is like I think it's across not just tabletop but video games too.
I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah.
Yeah, she was like Creator of the Year, and her show Rivals of Waterdeep is an all POC cast, and it's amazing. There's another one called Transplaner, which is all trans players and GM. These things are doing really well, and they're fantastic. The people that are some of the head people at Wizards of the Coast and other big companies are out and gay. So there's some representation there. There's still a lot of whiteness at the top, right? And that's in part because those are the people that have been in the industry the longest, because that industry was exceptionally white in the 80s and 90s. But it's getting better, and there were people of color and trans people back then too. It's just that there's even more now, and they're more visible. So it's kind of nice. And as somebody who observed Gamergate in the video game space from afar when it happened, and as it continues to ramify into, because those Gamergate people, a lot of the people that got recruited into that went straight into the 4chan and 8chan and QAnon and the alt-right and all those people. So that's just like this pipeline of disaffected young white guys. Exactly. So it's good to see the community pushing back of pretty hard against whenever there's like explicit problems, like somebody being inappropriate or racist. If somebody's gets called out and accused of harassment or sexual assault or grooming or something, or racism, there's a pretty thorough investigation, and it's taken very seriously. So it looks like the community's improving, at least enough to have headed off any Gamergate stuff, because at the time it was really touch and go. There was a period early in 5th edition when there was, the 5th edition, the WotC people were trying to be a little more inclusive and, a little more kind of progressive, and there were loud minorities of people. They themselves weren't minorities.
Right, exactly. Let's be clear about what we're saying here.
Right. They were loud. There were actually very few people, but they made themselves very loud, so that it seemed on the internet like there was this huge number of people that were opposed because they didn't like whatever wokeness and SJWs and all that. But of course, that's the majority of us, and I'm happy to say that there seems to, it's a delay, and it's not perfect. There's still work to be done, but I think it's heading in that direction.
Well, I think that, I'm so happy to hear that in so many different ways, because one of the things that I've always made, I guess, in my mind, I've had to think about a lot more explicitly as my kids have been getting involved with video games and things like this. But one of the things that I always remember is a distinction between, say, the video games and the tabletop role-playing games, especially, is that, in tabletop, you're in this role-playing, you're actually kind of engaged with this kind of collaborative process. And there's what struck me when my son in particular, when he started doing these kind of online games, but I could just basically take what you said about how you deal with your kids and say, yeah, basically we're talking the same language here. And like Minecraft is, his deal. But still there was these times to negotiate with just the way that he and some of his friends were talking to each other because of the certain kind of anonymity of the in the video game interface. And that's not the same. And I don't want to kind of like make this like a black-white distinction here, but in the tabletop role-playing, that interaction is a lot different, right? Because in many cases you're face-to-face, but even in the kind of, in this online environment, you're actually seeing each other and kind of working out problems together, and you're not necessarily trying to kill each other, right?
Right. Yes.
And so so to know that, and like that was the big question I had, was like, in that in-person space where a lot of people are doing that stuff, it seemed to be like that's a great space of possibility, right? Yeah. Because so much of the role-playing game is like people working and thinking about and kind of being flexible with their identities and how they're thinking about the world, and to see that there's these kind of accepting spaces within it, again with the caveat, not perfect, but still.
No, it's right. I think it's interesting because video games are much more, they're not as centralized as many video game creators would like, but when there's an online multiplayer space, like in a game like Minecraft or Fortnite. Well, Minecraft's a weird case because some people host their own servers and can create their own kind of social spaces. But games like Fortnite, there's just one collective server. And so the companies have kind of a lot of control over what the culture is like. They can decide whether to ban people and whether to institute rules that prevent or don't allow or don't allow chat or certain words in chat or voice chat or whatever. So they have a lot of control over that. But in tabletop role-playing games, you're really it's just a book. And it's a culture that happens among groups of friends at tables, at their houses, or at a game store, or maybe at a convention. And so it can be much more variable, right? So the problem is, if you go and talk to people who play role-playing games or who have tried them, you can always ask them, well, what was your first GM like, your first person organizing the game? And you'll hear nightmare stories from some people about how, well, they had this racist person or this sexist person who was running the game, or this awful person who was kind of a sadist on a power trip or whatever, right? That can happen.
Yep.
But thanks to online tools, and in particular, the explosion of streaming media, a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games are now happening live on the internet, and people can watch. And by watching, they can see what it looks like when other people play.
Yep.
And that allows those people to kind of model norms, right? So, and I think that's just like it used to be that at my table, this is how we play. And then you'd run into somebody at a game store and they play differently. Well, they're clearly the weird ones. But now you can see, oh no, actually, the Critical Role, who had 10 million viewers or whatever, and Dungeon Run and all of these different Three Black Halflings and Rivals of Waterdeep. No, they all are inclusive, are trying to be, or at least saying they're trying to be. They are not allowing racism and fascism and all that sort of stuff at their tables, and so they're setting the agenda for the community. And I think it's really working. Again, though, it's still a very white hobby, and the people at the top are still very kind of old guard white folks mostly. But progress is happening, and I feel like it's a much safer space for me and my kids to move in part because it's by nature collaborative, and it's about telling stories. What a basic human feature. And usually it's over a series of hours in a single session, and if you play a campaign, months, years. Right. I mean, when you get matched in a video game, you're playing with somebody for 30 seconds or 10 minutes, and they have an anonymous name, and you have an anonymous name, and you'll never see them again. And if you're angry and want to distract them, some people make the poor decision to just start saying awful things because they're immature and don't know how to handle it, I guess. But that is a lot harder to do when you're sitting at a table with somebody for 3 or 4 hours. Even if it's an online table, you're still talking to them, often looking at them on a camera, and that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to say to you now. We have one of our viewers, our regular viewers, Emily, is on there, and I just wanted you to hear this too as well. She just said, "This is encouraging," right? Oh, good. So, I mean, this is kind of my hope too as well, right? So, all right. So, one of the things that I'm sure there's going to be stuff that's going to be coming up in the future, and I would love to be able to have you back on the show at some point too as well to talk about some of the different developments. But I can't let you go until we talk a little bit, until you let folks know about this Superheroic Roleplaying for 5th edition and some of the other compendiums. Because I'll tell you, after this is not, I want everybody to know this, especially with the holidays coming up. This is a perfect example to head on over to Arcanist Press, right, and pick this stuff up. I mean, I went and I bought all the other ones. I was like, oh my God, it's not just one book. Right? There's all these other little campaigns that I can pick up for this.
Yeah, the core book is $4.99 on DriveThruRPG right now, and there's custom ancestries and more ancestries, and then I've got a couple thematic ones like Arctic or Gothic, and those let you play characters or create. There's all these ancestries and cultures listed that match fantasy creatures you've heard of, or that are matching geographic regions, because after all, in real history, geography has a lot more to do with culture than biology from your parents, right? So Arctic life is very different regardless of what your DNA is than tropical life. So things like that, right? You can do those. And then the Superheroic one, that is a Kickstarter we ran last summer. And we are going to be releasing that in January, February, early 2022. And, it takes the D&D rules, which are far and away the most widely known set of rules in the world for role-playing games. And it lets you play not a fantasy Tolkien-esque sort of game, but superheroes, because that's just such a huge genre night right now. And it's a lot of fun. But we used a little bit of we brought our sensibilities to it. So you don't choose race in that game. You choose ancestry and culture. So guess what? If you want to be Superman, an alien raised on Earth, you have alien ancestry and human earthling culture. If you want to be from the future, like Cable, or the past, or like I could go on. I could drop all the comic book references, but you get my point. Aquaman, right? Raised by humans, but he's an Atlantean, etc. And also there's lots of rules about and like guidance on, like, let's say you want to play. We're working with, like, for example, a disability activist and
that's awesome.
creator to, like, well, look, superhero genre has a problem historically with dealing with disability, right? And sometimes they do it well, but sometimes it's mishandled. So we're having her write about that, and so we're trying to bring that sort of progressive sensibility to a superhero game that's also fun. So.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic, and I know, I want everybody, if you're interested in this stuff, please head out over to, was it arcanistpress.com, right? Arcanist
Yeah,
Press.
that'll have links to all the products.
That'll have links out here. Ancestry and Culture, the alternative to race in 5e, is just a fantastic book. And I have to say this too as well. This is one of the things that was so exciting about getting kind of involved with D&D, kind of younger, is these books, right?
Yeah.
Is that you have these books to kind of look at and kind of imagine, and that, so and this is similar in that, be able to kind of even people are not going to be able to see it very well here, but having kind of like images and kind of imaginations that's there is just like, it's so much part of the culture and can be so exciting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So
No. There's a bunch of great art in there that depict some of these characters of mixed ancestry culture or just mixed ancestry. And I'll say this. Of course, if you purchase the product, that's great. But if you go to through the link at arcanistpress.com or at DriveThruRPG, there's a free preview that's 30 pages long. So you can read that intro essay. So even if you don't have any interest in D&D, but you are interested in like the fantasy genre, just in general, I would invite you to take a look at it, just because it might help you think more about your next, I don't know, season 2 of Shadow and Bone, or whatever your latest fantasy jam happens to be.
Right, 100%.
I guess it's Wheel of Time now.
Wheel of Time now. I just watched the first 3 episodes there, and I'm kind of
me too.
I've yet to figure out what I think about it yet. So, but I'm
same.
Same. I'm just waiting to see how the story develops. I mean, I like how it gets laid out. I like at least they're trying to do visually initially, but I'm
gonna wait. Same.
Exactly.
Same here.
Exactly. Well, Gwendolyn Marshall, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for talking about this. Has been an absolute pleasure. And again, everybody head on out there to arcanistpress.com. Check out Ancestry and Culture, an alternative to race in 5e. And if you have kids, and this is what I've been plugging on the show, you've heard me talk about this multiple times. If you have kids and you're trying to kind of navigate this whole space, and you're concerned about some of these issues, I know that we've had these discussions with some of the parent groups around here, and our pushback against these freaking, QAnon crazies and anti-CRT nut jobs. Excuse me for like using the language I should be using to describe them, but it's looking for places to kind of incorporate this kind of discussion in our kids' just kind of life, right? In a way that they can kind of inhabit these spaces. So, I mean, and thank you for like making this part of, people's experience, really.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Oh, you're great. All right. So this is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. I'll remind you. So we're going to take a quick break here and then say thank you to kind of Gwendolyn Marshall. And we'll kind of come back for if anybody's got some questions, comments, want to throw some things out. You got things that are happening in your community. I'll have some closing thoughts, let you a little bit know what's coming up on the show from here on out. So I'm probably going to talk a little more D&D after the break too as well. So you're just going to have to deal with that. All right. So thank you once again for kind of joining us here tonight. And I look forward to that superhero edition coming out soon.
Thanks.
All right, have a great one. This is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. Why don't you come back right after this quick break, and we'll talk some more. Hey, everybody. This is Ken Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. Welcome back for our little community meeting, like kind of after the show here. Got an extra cool, awesome surprise. Gwendolyn Marshall is sticking around with us. So if you do have any kind of questions, you have kind of comments, thoughts about this, feel free. You can either drop your comments right directly in the YouTube channel. Leave your I'll read them out here and we can talk about them there. And if you do want to kind of call into the show, there's information about how to call in through riverside.fm on the in our YouTube channel. Just remember, if you do call in, make sure that you turn off the sound on your YouTube channel, because just like a radio show, that if you don't do that, you're going to get all this feedback and there echoes and we'll have to have a problem, and we don't want a problem tonight, so come on. You know what I'm talking about. Well, thank you so much for sticking around for a little bit longer, because there's a bunch of stuff like I wanted to ask you about, but we didn't get a chance. I was being cautious on time. But so, I mean, this is just kind of, like I said, I work in higher ed too as well. I'm in kind of rhetoric and composition. I do stuff on social media and things like this. And my background is in rhetoric and social movements is really kind of where I'm located. And I just found, one, like I said, I came across the book Ancestry and Culture first, and then I'm like, digging in to say, oh wait, and you're a philosophy professor too as well, and you're there. I'm like, this is just freaking awesome. So I'm just curious. So are you teaching this stuff at all in your classes, or how do you see these kind of intersections with what you're doing in your kind of philosophical research and your academic background and what you're doing here in this this gaming space?
Well, I mentioned during the show just a little bit that my 20 years of practice of teaching some of these topics. I mean, for example, in my intro that I teach every semester includes some race stuff. It's got W.B. Du Bois and, a couple things in there. So I talk a little bit about race and gender in my class and have for many years. So I've got I briefly previewed like that little shtick about, if you go out to eat with somebody, it's just common decency to ask them what they might want to eat, or if they have an allergy, don't go to the shellfish. Right. Don't go to the crab place. It's right. This is just common decency. So if somebody has a trigger of certain content, you don't force them to experience it anyway. Why would you do that, right? That's just a jerk move. And being able to just put it in terms that people are like, oh, I never thought about it that way, is definitely the most relevant skill. But and that includes but I also think that, professors and humanities scholars in general, being able to boil down to, well, here's the concept underneath this, right? And that's what I think that's the advantage. I actually really need to thank Daniel Kwan, who was he's a great creator of it himself, but he runs the podcast Asians Represent, and which is great. He did this thing where he and some other of his friends deconstructed, or basically did a critical reading of the old Oriental Adventures book from the first edition D&D. Yeah. And it's a lot of great content there. But I brought him in as a kind of a consultant, a sensitivity reader and consultant on this, and a couple other people. But he has an academic background himself. He has I think he's ABD in anthropology or something. And he was like, you are a college professor. You have this opportunity to teach. Why don't you take advantage of it? And he was the one who said, maybe you should write an intro essay. And so I'm really grateful to him for pointing that out, because I think awesome. It really made a big difference. So that's kind of the first way it's really influenced. Being a philosophy professor has shaped this product. It's also helped with things like, I've been on a couple, 2 dozen podcasts and YouTube shows and Twitch streams and stuff, people asking questions and being able to answer, I have, questions and field that in a way that's productive is helpful. It has, but the influence goes the other direction too, because I am I've started doing kind of philosophy of games as an area of interest, which I had only. It's I like philosophy and I like games, right. but the intersection, right? But the intersection is its own little discipline that I hadn't studied much yet, and so I'm starting to do some of that now too, because I think, I like to talk about this stuff and I like to think about it, and so it is shaping my future research plans too.
Well, and I'm a huge fan of the kind of work that you did there in that intro essay too, as well, because and even the way you just talked about, like, say, things that trigger people, right? Because I mean,
Right.
we know the way that this nonsense gets kind of like railed off in right wing media and everything about, you know, woke culture and I'm triggered and all this kind of nonsense. When really all you're talking about is just being a decent human being, really, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like saying like, no, look, I'm saying like, okay, look, you know, I kind of like this thing, but I don't know if you like it too. So do you want to watch, or just to let you know, hey, watch this thing. This is a little bit of a scary movie that we're thinking about watching. You know, I don't know what you feel. I mean, just kind of common sense. We start approaching it like that, and taking it out of this kind of this discourse that gets established at, you know, in these weird levels, and just kind of relate to people like human beings. You're in a very different space and allow a different kind of communication, which I have to say, sometimes this has been one of the things that has frustrated me most about academic culture, is that it's everything that to use your example about the different influences, be saying like, okay, we can learn from popular culture, but then we're going to translate it into stuff that nobody wants to read, right?
Right. Oh yeah. Oh yes.
Right.
Oh, yes.
Right. For me, you talk about zine culture, right? I mean, I grew up punk rock too as well. I mean, I always tell the story about Jim Gelati on a skateboard riding down my hill growing up, and like him stopping, hey, what are you doing? Right? And Dead Kennedys, my love for Dead Kennedys was born at that moment, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's like, it was so funny though, because like so I don't know, kind of in that culture and kind of getting involved with zine culture. I mean, that's essentially what Raging Chicken is. I mean, that's how I started. Is like, okay, when in 2010, when you had the Tea Party victory, when it kind of like ramped. Well, actually, your neck of the woods, right? I mean, kind of really had the in Wisconsin, right? You had Governor Idiot kind of launch the assault on labor and the assault on all this. But that was basically, it was in 2010. And watching that take place, then watching what was happening in Wisconsin, and then knowing that we just elected a Tea Party governor here in Pennsylvania, and I'm thinking like, okay, my daughter was just about to be born, right? My wife and I both made the kind of huge kind of rookie mistake with our first kid, which was we thought like, hey, we're going to do all this together, like we're going to stay up and we're going to get up with him and we're going to do this other stuff. And the problem with that picture was great in theory, but the problem is that he never slept for more than an hour and a half at a time. And so both of us were so sleep deprived, right? And as we just couldn't, we had to like, wait a minute, we got to rethink it. we have to factor sleep in here. So I had that in my mind when all this was going on, and I was just saying like, I need to do something. I know I'm not going to be able to spend the time organizing on the ground, given the fact we've got a daughter coming. But I went back to what I've done before. It's like, okay, we're going to start a publication because there's a dearth of progressive left media in the state, and I know how to do this. I did I studied blogs. We did we did some initial kind of studies of like using blogs in a composition classroom when blogging was early on and stuff. And so thought okay, yes, make use of this stuff. And over the years, what I found is that the influence of working in that space, right, and this kind of this popular space, has really changed the way I think about writing, about communication.
Yeah.
And I find it now kind of coming back into my classroom in ways, right, that I'm much less concerned with the performative aspects of academia when I'm talking with my students, and actually trying to think about what is it that has always grabbed me about this stuff, what gets me excited about that, and that becomes the focus. So it's kind of interesting to see you doing a similar kind of thing here.
Oh, absolutely. I think that, I used to joke about, it was maybe 10 years out, or 5 or 10 years out, I finally flicked the little advisor off my shoulder, who had been looking over, standing and whispering in my ear and saying like, well, I wouldn't teach that, right? And part of that is that my own research over the past, 6 or 7 years has focused on kind of challenging the canonical ways in which certain topics and texts are taught. And in fact, the canon itself, I teach the history of philosophy, modern period. And so traditionally that's taught as a kind of just a parade of dead white guys.
Yep.
And I got a textbook and some other stuff in my professional stuff is out versions of the story that include women, authors of color, etc. And it's actually more historically accurate because a lot of those people were written out of the histories by, well, white supremacists in 19th century.
Exactly.
Honestly.
There you go.
And so I've already kind of like learned to focus on what makes me enthusiastic because I've discovered it's contagious. And if I actually care about it, the students, even if they don't, I don't want them to, the way I tell them is, I'm not here to teach you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think.
Yep.
Right. And so it's not that I'm enthusiastic about getting them to agree with me. It's that, although that's nice when it happens, I guess. It's that you know, I'm enthusiastic about the very prospect of thinking that these issues matter, and it's great to see that infectious. And so, you know, like before, so I've got like a science fiction and philosophy class, right, that I teach. Nice. That is, you know, that's like, I get so many people taking that class and my intro that are like, well, I needed a credit for humanities. Oh my gosh, I had no idea that I would like thinking about stuff like this. I'm like, yes, critical thinking can be is important, but also it doesn't have to be a drag, right? And that totally has fed back into my attitudes about publications. I don't care. Here, very important. Let's face it. This is about the material conditions and economic relations, isn't it?
Right. Yep.
I have tenure.
100%. Yep, that's exactly it.
I have tenure, so I get to care about. I have had more people, that 3 pages at the beginning of Ancestry and Culture has been read by more people than every other academic thing I've published combined. And I've got 3 books and a dozen more articles. None of those have anything like the readership of this Ancestry and Culture, which is like over, like, you know, thousands and thousands of people have read it. So, I mean, yeah, you know, obviously.
No, totally. It is what I tell my students is like, you know, when in our writing classes in particular, I said, look, you know, I have like when they're just finishing up their kind of the research project for the thing. And, you know, we do this kind of model when we choose like a theme at the beginning and just for kind of like just modeling how you kind of engage with, you know, particular topics. We did climate change this year. And so we read a range of texts, and the idea is that you start from a jumping off point. This one was the IPCC report around, you know, climate that was just released, and then watching, you know, all the kind of people responding to that, right? And then other voices that are kind of trying to make sense of it and looking across genre and what happens. And anyways, so we do that all together, but then the remainder 2/3 of the semester, right, you know, they're building their own research project from the ground up. And like my number one thing is say, look, you're going to start with the give a shit principle, right? The give a shit principle is like, if you don't give a shit about what you're writing about and what you care about, right, then you know what? This is going to be as boring as all hell for you, right?
And that means it's not going to be as good quality either.
Right, exactly.
You know,
it's like
because you just won't put up with it if you don't care.
No, it's gonna be boring to you. It's gonna be boring to me, right? I mean, no one's gonna pick something like that off the shelf. So why don't you start with this? So this is your number one charge. You've got you cannot tell anybody that like I told you had to write about this stuff, because that's not gonna happen, right? And then I have a caveat that's similar to what you had said there too as well. I say, listen. Is that I'm very clear about when I'm speaking about my position or my opinion on something. So I mark it off, right? Say, okay, well, hear it. I say, you know, the last thing I want to hear is somebody tell back to me what my opinion is, because I'm sick of hearing myself talk as enough as it is. I want to hear what you've got to say. Right. That's what's interesting. And, you know, and I'm always like, whatever, this is what the little idealist in my mind is like, you know, this is like democratic praxis, right? Where you're having to kind of negotiate differences and having both the courage of being, you know, of putting yourself out there and being vulnerable, but then also being respectful and responding and kind of exchanging in those differences. And, you know, and that's the excitement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I teach at Florida International University, and it's the largest majority university in the country. So, no kidding. Yeah, it's like 60,000 people and 70% Latino or 60 something percent. And it's only about 15% white. And many of those, about half of them are first generation college students, and some percentage of them are also immigrants, or certainly the children of immigrants, if not themselves. They have just so much experience to bring to the table that I don't have, that why on earth would I just want them to have this narrow range of experience that I have? I want them to find stuff in their lived experience that matters to them, that's relevant to the course material or whatever. That's so much more enriching for them and me to read, right? I did the thing where I taught them they had to write the boring this is what everybody writes about,
Right.
In the intro to philosophy or whatever, or in my history classes. It's tedious. They don't like it. I don't like grading it. So yes, I want to learn from them too,
Yeah, totally. And it opens up a whole range of different things. Hey, I just got a question come in from JJ. I think this is a new list. The question was, and it's funny, I have this on my desk too as well, because this is another thing I was going to say, well, if we had time to talk about, is that this Tasha's Cauldron of Everything.
Yeah.
Right. Which was interesting. It's interesting reading this in connection with yours. Right.
Yes.
And I actually bought the Tasha's one second, right? Because I bought yours first. And I'm like, well, and I was reading, people, some critical assessments of what they were what they were doing there, and saying, okay, yeah, this is kind of like you're dipping your pinky toe in. They seem to want to open it up, but it's like talking about race, but not talking about race yet, still building in the flexibility. So I'm curious your just thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So for those who don't know, basically they said like, oh, hey, here's an optional set of rules. Anything goes. Take any race and give it any trait and any ability scores. And it's just kind of a free for all.
Well, was that do you know if that was a response to critiques about this? Because I couldn't, it seemed like, looking at the timelines, but there was nothing that was saying that they were actively trying to respond to this, but it seems like they were trying to respond to.
No, they were. I mean, but if by this you mean the cry in the community, I mean, they weren't, I'm not claiming they were responding to my book.
No. I mean, the pressure to really think critically about race and push back around questions of race.
So just to be clear, I came up with my stuff in the winter of 2019-20. And then I kickstarted it in February 2020, and then it was out for sale in like May or June of 2020, which was right when. So I had already written it; it was done, but it just so happened to correspond by total accident with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter resurgence. Right? Of course, Black Lives Matter started as a movement in Ferguson, right? Yeah. But they had a big resurgence in that time, and people started talking very extensively about it in fantasy culture and our fantasy genre and in D&D tabletop role-playing games. And so Wizards of the Coast in June issued a statement that they hear this and they're going to start addressing it going forward in their books. So like tune in soon and we'll have solutions to these problems that you have rightfully pointed out. We'll try and do better. And then the next book that dealt with character creation, Tasha's, came about 6 months later, and it had 1.5 pages at the very beginning of this long book full of all kinds of stuff. And it did feel to a lot of people like it was a last minute edition and it was kind of rushed. There's also, we'll never know the details. There was also somebody who was a freelancer that was working there temporarily, a non-binary person named Orion Black, and they went on Twitter a month or two later and talked about how their feedback was rejected and they felt like they were tokenized and weren't treated very well. All of this is, no one knows what really went on there, but I can say that that Wizards of the Coast's people continue to say they want to keep doing better on these things. So I didn't think Tasha's did really helped solve the problem, because it was like, well, if you don't like the way it's written in their core book, which is essentialist, you can just do whatever you like, which is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater for me, in my mind. But I still am waiting for the phone call. Wizards of the Coast hasn't called me to ask if they can use my system. That's fine. But no, I think Tasha's is fine as a stopgap, but it's not very satisfying to me because it doesn't actually get to do away with the essentialism across the universe. Basically, it says explicitly your player characters are the heroes of your story, so they're exceptional. And so I balk a little bit about the idea that, I'm going to make a drow, which are the dark elves, which are traditionally evil by nature, and I'm the good one. You're one of the good ones. There's a trope there that's really problematic, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, some of my best friends are. Right. We've heard that before. Right. So the latest book has been announced that's coming. Or it's either they're going to be changing drow lore now too, so that there are multiple sects, SECTS, of drow that some are evil and some are good, and it's a cultural thing. So they that's new. And that is quite clearly like, oh, you're right. We shouldn't say that drow are biologically evil just because they live underground or have dark skin, right? It's a cultural thing. And they even sometimes use these words like lineage or ancestry and culture. So they're clearly aware of the issue. But Jeremy Crawford, who is the lead rules designer for Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons and Dragons, put it perfectly in an interview in December after Tasha's came out. He said, we have to walk a fine line, a tightrope really, between, on the one hand, wanting to do better on these progressive political issues, but also feeling an obligation to be the stewards of the legacy of the game. And I understand that from a business point of view, they don't want to alienate all of these nostalgia gamers by making it not anything like the old game. But you got to wonder about some of the elements of that legacy that they feel they need to retain, right?
Totally. I mean, I think that again, having no idea, right, talking completely out my ass on this one, but I mean, what that sounds like to me is like saying, okay, you've got like a situation that needs to clearly change, and we've got a bunch of people with a lot of power over here, right? We're afraid of them, right? So we're afraid of them. So because of them, we're going to talk around this issue. I mean, because look, I mean, I understand it, but I understand that you could say from a business angle of things, like you always got to make choice. People always got to make choices. And so you can say like, okay, look, if you're like want the old nostalgia thing, guess what? You can still do that. Right?
The old games are still available too. You can still go buy them.
Well, even if you take
fifth edition, yeah.
Well, you know what I'm saying? It's like you don't have. You can just use the old editions, or you can kind of like adapt them in such a way that they fit your kind of like, I don't know, your freaking fantasy of what it was to be a white guy in the heartland. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. You know, I mean, like literally,
absolutely.
If that's what you
want. I mean,
this
is an issue that I think a lot of that people bring up, like in response to a product like mine or some of the concerns that I've raised. They say, and this is true about role-playing games, is that it's a collaborative storytelling game. And that means that different groups of people can tell different sorts of stories. Yep. And like, for example, if one D&D game or one tabletop role-playing game will be very serious, it'll be kind of very much like a Tolkien-esque Lord of the Rings. Everyone's, these big archetypical kind of characters and good versus evil. And others are like slapstick comedy. Yeah, and some of them are like, have like romance elements and others don't. It's just whatever story you want to tell. These are tools to tell stories. So on the one hand, some people respond to me and say, look, you don't need to change any rules. Just change it at your table. Homebrew it is what that's called. The problem with saying that is that you then leave the socially inclusive option not as the official version and have it be like, oh, by the way, if you don't like our racism, you can just not use that part.
Exactly. And that's the difference right there.
It should be the reverse,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
The default should be not racist. And then if you really, and hey, look, let me be clear. Some good stories engage with the topic of race and racism effectively. And sometimes it's really intense and horrific. And you need one of those content warnings to say like, look, this is going to have some pretty graphic depictions of slavery in it. Do we want to have a game where we engage with that? Some people, like, they say, I want to be the one who just save, like, let's have a war to liberate slaves or something in my little fantasy world. Okay, if everyone's on board with that, fine, you opt into that. That should not be the default.
Right.
So and you can do that. So those people that still want to have elves, just be elves. Don't be bringing all that in there. Fine. Choose ancestry and culture, elf.
But guess what? Now you got to work for it. Right?
Yeah, right.
I think that really is what the difference is. It's like, one, you actually had everything handed out for you and it mirrored your reality, like for like these generations. Like you grew up in the kind of your way, and now you're being asked to say, oh no, if you want to continue doing that, you're going to have to do a little work instead of have it handed it to you. Right?
Yeah, it just decenters the white male experience. Cishet white guy is just no longer the default, or it shouldn't be. Right. We see this in all forms of mass media pop culture. It comes up in video games about the fact that there now more video game companies are trying to make efforts to have women and protagonists and kind of different like people of different gender and sexual orientations be your protagonists. And it's nice to see inclusivity in that way. But there's always that pushback about why you got to make it about race. It was always about race. It was just about when it was your race, right. You didn't mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was struck by this one, and this actually came up. I've had this like amusing experiments watching some of the like the official kind of Wizards of the Coast channels on YouTube, and they had I don't know if which one it was. I don't know if it was the official channel or if it was D&D Beyond one. It was one of the two, right. And they had 3 black halflings on, kind of, and they were talking about their experience, right? And it was just like in some ways everything was like kind and like I mean you know their show, so there's like they're funny as all hell, right? They're telling like, and so but they're very, very thoughtful about their own experiences, right? And so you have these 2 like younger hosts that were on there, both young white, like a man and woman, kind of on there, kind of like, dude, you're going to represent these positions and stuff, and they're being welcoming, but you could feel like the kind of the tension of the cultures out of which these different folks were coming. Like, I mean, I was looking at the host, and I'm like, yeah, I mean. Yeah, I get it, right? But man, you're pasty, right? It's like, and not, I don't mean that just in terms of like complexion, but I mean just in terms of like a cultural reference point.
Absolutely.
And so there was this great kind of tension all through the interview where there was no like moment where there's a direct confrontation over the questions of race, but those folks from the 3 black halflings were kind of telling their stories of like playing games and saying, oh yes, I remember kind of growing up and saying, getting involved with D&D, and then go to a table and say, oh, you're here, okay, so you're going to have to be an orc. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, but maybe you could be a good orc. Right. I mean, and things like this. And so you could, this is just them telling their experiences of what these moments were in the gaming, and some of the reasons why they decided that they were going to start that show, and that we're going to be talking about those experiences doing the gaming. But so it's interesting, and I, get to see it's like, these legacy cultures that hang on for so, and again, this is not, D&D, this is not any different than so many
it's
other
just a microcosm, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And I love hearing those stories from people like 3 Black Halflings, or I mentioned Rivals of Waterdeep, and, or Transplaner, or Asians Represent, Daniel Kwan's podcast. Hearing those, I mean, yes, we should have stories and representation for people that don't, I mean, whatever. I guess now technically I am no longer. I used to even make a joke in class that like I thought I was at the time, cis-het, white male, married with 2 kids, who grew up in a Midwestern suburb, raised Catholic. I mean, wow, right? I don't think there's a single relevant social demographic on which I'm not the quote unquote majority. Right. Okay, now that I'm a trans woman and, okay, things are a little different, but I still have that experience growing up. Yep. And it doesn't have to always be, there's media for me. I can go watch Stranger Things and be like, yep, that was me as a kid, minus the supernatural stuff. Yep. And, but why shouldn't we have media that captures more? I mean, like, it's also, by the way, good business to create spaces that include more people. I mean, which is, of course, why these corporations are slowly turning. Oh, the ship is slow. It's slow and too slow.
But the whole idea, I mean, I really do. I've become like so fascinated with that. Like, okay, I remember, like, again, I told you my brother Ryan recommended I check out Dungeon Run, right, during COVID and stuff. And I remember him saying, we text back and forth kind of periodically about it, and he said to me one point, like, when I just started watching, hey, listen, I wanted to let you know I'm taking your advice, and I'm plowing through. I'm already on episode 10, and they're 3 hours apiece.
Oh wow! Yeah.
And he's like, I never thought I would cry watching a video watching a YouTube thing of D&D, and damn it, I mean, it's like. That's it right there, right? I mean, it's because, and you watch the players, right? Them really get really emotional at times because like they're invested in the story, and I'm sitting there with like tears coming down my eyes, right? And it's like that experience right there, that shared collaborative space, and like the only other time that I've ever kind of like been in that space for longer periods of time is like when I've been kind of, whether it's been union, I've worked as a union organizer for a while, kind of did that organization and working in kind of activist spaces where you're creating this thing together. Right. We did all sorts of guerrilla theater and everything like this where, you're literally building shanty towns on like, like
oh, wow.
as part of, and you're inhabiting these spaces, and there's nothing like that. And to see the same kind of stuff where you're involved in a story, and then once you've said that, you get to, the people at that table get to determine the course of that story. Right. Yeah. About how people react and who they can be in those spaces. And I actually really, this is the other thing I was asking myself a lot of questions about, was like, when I'm designing my own story is like, how, like, where do you set the guardrails, right? Kind of like, because you got a storyline that you're developing and all this, and then say, well, you can be contingent about it, right?
Oh yeah.
And watching people do that, it's fascinating. And to have that experience, right, for more people to negotiate. I can imagine, and I've watching, I can't remember which one it was, where then having to negotiate questions of, say, race and sexuality and all this as part of the game dynamic is fascinating.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I totally get that vibe. I mean, get that feeling with what you're saying. And I agree. I mean, but it makes sense, right, though, because this is storytelling, and we can just watch a TV show and become incredibly invested and cry when a character dies and be moved, and same thing with the literature if we're reading it. But the thing is, when you're actually playing, so I don't want to I'm not going to denigrate people who just watch their role-playing games.
No, sure,
That's
sure.
fine. But if you're, it's basically improv theater you're watching, right? But when you're playing, there's something else special extra that's going on. And, I don't know the brain science, but there is some that's about that concerns this. You are enacting a role.
Yes.
You are speaking in the voice of this character. You are saying, you very often switch from my character will do this to I'm going to do this. And after the fact, when you're talking to your friends, you'll say something like, you remember that time we went to the mountains to fight the dragon? We did that. Not my characters, or do you remember that time we told a story about? It's as though we had those experiences, right? So there's this kind of, it's more than just reading the fiction or watching the TV show, because you're enacting it, right? With your imagination, your voice, your body, sometimes even. And that makes it even more kind of somatic, more physical, and it gets more it accesses your emotions even more. And it can be, I have look, before I realized I was transgender, I played a lot of characters that were femme and women, just because it was fun. And I didn't realize it was also a way for me to, I didn't realize at the time that it was also a way for me to kind of explore, what does it feel like to try on this role, right? And what a great opportunity. Role play is super powerful. And there's a reason that human culture may very well have started by telling stories around a fire. You know what I mean? It feels that primordial to me sometimes. So we want to make it something that can bring that kind of feeling. Absolutely. I love sharing it with people and turning people on to this sort of thing, because it can be really amazing. So I love it.
No, what an experience. That's like the best possible kind of experience you can imagine. And to set the parameters, and again, this is why I love what you did in this book too, is like to set the parameters in such a way that we're going to have, I like what you said before, like the default here is going to be about like, a kind of a more just possibility, right? One where, essentialism and the brutality of their history, again, it's not like we can just leave it behind and pretend that it's not there, right? But that actually allows it to kind of do something else, so we can make different choices. And I think that's what's been fascinating me more and more as I kind of get back into doing this stuff, is just you're saying, I teach a class that's called New Media Story Change that I'm teaching right now, right? Oh. And looking at the role of storytelling in social movements, right? And so much of it about being about the rhetorics of solidarity, right? About how reading this, there's this group of folks that come out of they're out of Oakland. They're called Center for Creative Storytelling, or Center for creative change or something. I can't believe I'm forgetting their name right now, but we're reading their book in the class, and they walk through the kind of importance of collective storytelling, right? And I'm like seeing like all these parallels in terms of what is happening in these kind of, you know, D&D spaces and the other kind of collaborative storytelling spaces, and how they're talking about kind of creating community around kind of sustainable social movements. And I'm saying, yeah, this is like literally kind of the same kind of engagement in different types of spaces, and the more of those spaces that we have, that we can do that, which is allowing us to imagine different futures. I mean, man, that's the winner right there in my mind.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's a great time.
Well, cool. Well, all right. Well, listen, I'm gonna go make sure my kids are getting ready for bed.
Same here. Yeah, it's bath time over there.
Yeah. There you go. Well, again, thanks so much for, especially hanging out kind of even longer. I really appreciate it. And you know, I'm literally plugging your stuff with everybody I come across that does this stuff.
Well, thank you so much.
No,
I appreciate it.
Practically putting it in their hands. I'm like, no, just take it for a while. Here, just you go read it. It's like a short read. Here you go.
Yeah, like I said, there's that free preview too, if you really just want to take a glance at it. But no, I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. I had a great time talking, and you know, I was the right choice to stick around. So
yeah. Fantastic. All right. Well, hey, everybody, for all you out there still sticking around, kind of hope you enjoyed tonight's show. This is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. Want to remind you once again that we will not be here for the Wednesday show or our Friday Politics Roundup this week. We're going to take our little breather right now and kind of try to kind of enact a little bit of downtime, self-care time, right? When we get to take a little break from things, kind of try to be around and focus on the folks that we care about, that we love, and kind of gear up for, you know, the struggles ahead. So here we have. So this is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. Reminder, you can help support this show by going to patreon.com/rcpress. Become a patron for those $5 a month, right? You can do it. We'll see y'all next week. Take a check into our socials, let you know what's coming up. See ya!